Hey guys, Vol here, how are you? It's 2017. Hopefully it'll be a good year. I know it's been a little while since I did a video about Infinity, the game, so we're going to launch into it and have a chat about a couple of issues. Hopefully you guys check out the forums and recently saw a post that I made on the Infinity forums, and I'll just move my camera over here. It was titled Your Decision Upon Winning the Lieutenant Role, and I linked to it in my previous video, and I'll link to it in the video description again. And what it's about is a thought experiment, a philosophical infinity scenario where all of the external criteria hopefully are at a neutral point where they're not really relevant to the lieutenant role, and you're trying to decide whether to go first or second or choose the table side. So let's have a look at it. So it says you're at a tournament, you're about to play a match, and the mission is engineering deck. And I chose engineering deck for this poll because I was looking for an example of a mission where I don't particularly think there's a huge advantage for going second or first compared to some missions where, for example, seize the antennas. That's a mission where you really do want to go second because it's so easy to actually move onto the objective in the last turn, giving your opponent no chance of retaliation and winning that way. Or Nimbus Zone, where you probably should go first because as soon as one player has actually connected the antennas, then the other player can't actually get those points. So those points are basically first in, first served. They're up for grabs. You've got to get them straight away. So that's where taking first turn matters more. If you're new to wargaming in general, this might not make a lot of sense, but if you've played a lot of wargames, you'll probably know that that tempo is important, and when you've got a fixed turn limit, first turn or second turn is quite important, especially when it comes to threat trading and so forth. I remember playing quite a lot of Warhammer Fantasy back in the day, and one thing about that game was that if you have the last turn of the game, you can commit your troops and try and break their units and chase them down without fear of retaliation by putting your guys out of position and have them actually counterattack. So second turn could have been good. Also sometimes in first turn, if you're playing first turn, if they've got a lot of big threats like a dragon or a big chariot or something which is fearsome, and you've got some cannons or some spells or something very fast, if you can destroy them in the first turn, it just eliminates the threat before they have the chance to use that threat. So that's that sort of tempo, and I think that Infinity works in a similar sort of way. War Machine Hordes is a little bit different because with that game there's no turn limit. So really, you might be going first because you want to be the first one to complete the criteria for winning in scenario, whereas second turn doesn't equate to last turn, whereas in Infinity it does. So back to engineering deck, that is a mission where it's end of game scoring rather than end of round scoring. So I think second turn is a little bit better there. But the thing is, if you're winning on attrition and you've been playing first, you can secure the two objectives on your side of the table and possibly the middle one, and then one of their ones as well. So it means they have to jump onto two different areas to actually take the objectives back from you, which might be too difficult for them to do if you've done well in your 3 turns of offensive action. You might need to go back and have a little look at the mission to see what I mean by that. And maybe there could have been a more neutral example. Maybe Comm Center or something like that is better, where you've got killing specialists as well as touching the objectives or classifieds, things like that. So moving on. Say we're playing at a tournament, the mission's engineering deck, and you're running a fairly well-rounded list. It's not too light on aero pieces, so it's got a little bit of that, but it's not a skew list. It's not all about, say, like 4 missile launchers in a Haramaki Link team, and at least 1 or 2 good offensive options, so it's not completely devoid of things that can attack. Maybe you have a drop trooper or a impersonator or a bulleteer or something that can actually attack very well. Next up, you don't know much about your opponent except that he or she is not running a unusual list. So again, when you play Infinity against people you know, your idea of how to win and how to beat them and how to win the mission has a lot to do with the kind of list that you know that they run and the way that they like to play Infinity. But let's say you're playing somebody new that you don't really know too much about, but you understand that they're not really playing some sort of skew list. Maybe you have that information. We also won't talk too much about factions. So then, looking at the table, the density fits your normal preference for not too dense, not too sparse, without being exactly symmetrical. One side is clearly preferable, but not by much. So you make the lieutenant roll and you win. What decision do you make? Will you go and pick the table side you prefer so you can deploy second and give the turn order to your opponent? Or will you actively take first and let your opponent decide on the table side? Or will you specifically take second and have both the disadvantage of deploying first and going second? And in this poll, 52.94% of people who have voted so far decided they'd pick the table side. 31.37 decided they'd just go out for turn order straight away and go first. And only 15.69% decided to take second. So I want to take the time to break this down a bit. Maybe I'll just grab a game on engineering deck that I did recently. This is a game I had against Garth. Alright, here it is here. So this is my table side here. As you can see, there's plenty of stuff to hide behind in the deployment zone. So I've got my Guija over here, which is sticking out above this standard paper terrain from Corvus Belli. But he could equally have actually positioned himself to the left behind this building here and been in total cover. But I wanted to use him to provide AROs with his multi-HMG in the explosive round. I can also put guys prone on top of this building or this building. I've got spaces of the Quangxi and the Shaolin Monks to be deployed but not move straight into AROs. And of course I've got some skirmishes as well that don't really care about the deployment zone terrain as much. So this table, I'm okay going second here because there's plenty of terrain to hide my guys behind. Even though I'm playing something like 18 orders in the list, or maybe 16 regulars and 2 irregulars, I feel like I'm safe enough from an enemy attack. If there's a drop trooper, the Quangxi are going to deal with that in the flanks. If he's moving up with a bulleteer or something like that, I've got troops which can react accordingly. There's lots of different ways that I can defend well enough, and so long as I don't lose half my army, and it's unlikely that'll happen with the pieces I've set up, I'll have the final turn which will give me a greater chance of being able to push back and take objectives. So that's why I would have actually hoped to go second. But bringing up this thread again, this forum discussion, a lot of people made some really good comments, and I was surprised. I usually only post on the Infinity forum because I've got a bit of a masochistic streak. I like the drama, I like the trolls, I like the banter. Sometimes it's a bit too much to bear, and most of the time the responses posted on this forum are really absurd and uninformed, sadly. But today was an exception, or the 20th of December was the exception, sorry, when I posted it. Let's have a look at what some people have been saying. Grey Templar says, I like to go second, particularly against lists that are fairly low on orders. I agree with that. I do the same thing as well, especially since my opponents usually play, what, about 12 to 14 orders. I play more like 16 to 20 orders. It also gives you the last turn of the game, he says. I'll only go first if I have a massive numbers advantage and don't care about suffering the -2 order penalty. That's a good point. So if you are going second, you can impose the command token expenditure to subtract 2 orders from their pool. So they can't do that to you going first. So that actually can make a big deal, especially if they have few orders. So I like his reasoning there as to why second turn is very good. Nate Te Aggressa says, for me, turn preference is determined by how the mission is scored. In pretty much any scenario where most scoring is determined by board state at the end of the rounds or game, I prefer to go second. Excellent, well said, I agree, I do the same. In my experience, he says, it's easier to score points when your opponent will not have a turn to stop you between the end of your movement and scoring. Examples are engineering deck, quadrant control, frontline. Absolutely spot on. I definitely agree with that. Quadrant control is a blatant example of a scenario where going second is so crucial. Because if you're going first, you have to end your turn with your models in position. So you have to have your left-hand zone captured and your right-hand zone captured, and preferably one of their ones if you want to get the 2 points for that round. Now your opponent just needs to see where your stuff is. If you've secured a zone using cheap troops, they just put a slightly more expensive trooper in that zone. They don't have to kill anything, they've already taken that zone. Or if you put something out in the open, they can just shoot that particular model, put something in that zone, and they've picked up that scoring round. And they don't have to overcommit, whereas you have to overcommit. So if you've got a 30-point model in that zone, and they know that because they're an experienced player, they know how much that, Guilang Fort Observer costs, they just have to put down a 35-point or 31-point model, and they've beaten you in that zone. So it just becomes ridiculously difficult to win a mission like that if you're having to go first. So even though outright picking the second turn means that your opponent gets to attack and see where your stuff is to attack. So you're deploying first and going second. So that looks like a bad disadvantage. You'll probably win if you can hold off the attack because of the massive scoring advantage based on the scenario. Frontline's the same. At the end of the game, if you've left guys in the central strip, but not very much in your home zone strip, close to your deployment zone, your opponent could just ignore the middle and move a drop trooper or TO camo marker into that zone and pick up 5 points to your 3. So it's just really massive. Also, if you've moved your guys into the middle of the table, guess what? It's easier for them to move in and kill those guys because they've got less distance to travel, less orders needed to get there and find the angles to take them down. So really, really like this post here by Nate to Aggressor. Alchemedi says, I prefer going first even though I play usually 10 to 12 order lists, but playing JSA or Tunguska, I prefer alpha striking for the former and preparing the terrain for my opponents for the latter. So with the former he means JSA, so striking, and terrain for opponents for Tunguska. So it's more of a factional situation choice for this poster. It says, mostly I stopped taking deployment because I've yet to learn how to deploy well, plus my opponents usually have more orders and it feels like letting them score lots of objectives if I go second. So I think what he's saying there is that for people who haven't really got comfortable with where to deploy their models in their army with a game plan, it's a bit easier to give that to their opponent and make the game more about using the models and acting with them, and I totally respect that point of view. The Invincible Army, very well-known Yujing player and poster on the forum. I like to choose deployment so that I can counter-deploy accordingly or rethink my deployment options. Okay, so this guy perhaps has a style where he wants to counter position with his opponent and especially use ARO pieces. That's the impression that I get, and I understand why people would want to deploy second, because if your opponent has committed to a fire lane with a really powerful ARO piece like a TR bot or a sniper or in a link team, and you feel you'll have trouble dealing with that, then you could ignore that table side with the troops that will be vulnerable to those troops. That makes sense. He goes on to say, sometimes a certain position or nest will look great from the outset and I'll have an idea what to put there, then my opponent deploys his force. So this is exactly what I was saying. Sometimes I'll choose first turn if I know I've got a list that's going to be order efficient and be able to withstand a counterattack either through its eliteness or attrition, or sometimes if the mission really favors a first turn push. However, I hate the -2 order penalty trying to enact plan A on 8 orders in the main pool, so I'll often choose deployment unless the mission gives me a good reason not to. Well said, I like this post. Section 9 tells us what he will choose, but doesn't give any reasons for that. Flyke, Phylk, don't know how to pronounce his name, but he did pretty well in Interplanetario, so a lot of people respect this player. He does say a lot of things, importantly linking us to his article here, which I did read, and there were a few things that I really liked about what he said. He goes over that, and you can read the post in a bit more detail on the forum. So let's just have a little look. He says, here are the general steps for deciding. Read the mission in advance, decide whether they favor going first or second, analyze the table zones. If one side's vastly superior, take the safe pick, get the good deployment zone. Right, okay, so I think what I got most out of this guy's opinion is that there actually should be a bit more disparity between table side 1 and table side 2, and that's one thing that my games have been a bit guilty of, and you may have seen that in my battle reports. Since I posted that thread on the forum and read everything there, I've actually been deliberately trying to create some tables which are a little bit more skewed. So this is a table from a game I played quite recently where on this deployment zone there's a very large Bandua games building where you can deploy all of your aero stuff really high up. There's only one big line of sight locker in the middle, but it's not that big, and there's some bigger buildings, plenty of hiding terrain there, whereas my opponent just really does not have much. There's a little bit of area terrain here, and this is the other side of the deployment zone, but that's about it. That's all he's got to deploy on. So we deliberately tried to create that after both talking about the thread and the situation and the philosophy behind it, just to make the choice of table side more relevant. And this guy's post here, I think did remind me of the fact that if your table is just too symmetrical, then it starts to become more a matter of turn order than it is about deploying on a particular table side. So I felt that's a valuable opinion. He did say a lot of other stuff above that, but that's the main thing I got out of it. We'll skip the filler comments here. Nate Aggressor backs up his comment again. He says a bit more about it. So there's a huge swing for having connected consoles at the end of the game, so this flipping it over. And that's a good point. So if your opponent takes a console and then you take it back, that's a massive exchange in points, and it only matters which way the console is swinging at the end of the game, not partway through. So this guy does talk about the willpower of your lieutenant. That's important. Okay, so Vorthane says, I always go first, especially if I'm using Hakislam with Fides or Yazbir. The order deficit is typically enough to chop up shotgunners or automatic specialists and so forth. So I think this is a really good point, and this is something I've been overlooking lately, and that is if your list includes models that really need the first turn to benefit the most from their skill set, like a Fide or Aljabal, who's also a impersonator or speculo killer, or maybe you've got an Oniwaban or Shinobu Kitsune who have superior infiltration, and you really want to be getting the most out of that to maximize their ability. So if you're going second, you can't benefit from that very well. If you put those models on their side of the table, their troops can reposition and get out of the way of wherever they think your models are, or in the case of the TO camo, they might even use a sensor bot to reveal it early if they are very clever about where they think you are. So if your plan is to maximize the use of those models, and you've specifically taken a list possibly with Saladin to give you the opportunity to put your reserve model down as a first player after their entire list is deployed, then you probably should go first, despite the scenario, because your strategy is about just crippling them, wiping them out, making it so that they can't even take back the objectives at the end of the game because they've just been so badly obliterated. So the rest of the posts from here are generally reiterations of what's been said so far. Sergeant Holcomb, a man from America, writes a massive novel here, and I'm not going to read it all out on my video here. The one thing that he does say, which I find interesting, is that he basically calls out the strategy which I have used sometimes with Imperial Service, which is where all of my stuff's hidden behind total cover and all of the corners are defended by chain rifles, and I'm not using any arrow pieces. So he says here that the counter to that is to move up with guns like shotguns, which can take out several models in a row and really cripple the bunched up deployment of those sorts of models. And yes, I agree with that. I think that's one way to deal with them. I think that one thing that's making some of my opponents struggle so much against my Imperial Service is that perhaps we've been using too much terrain. Maybe our tables are a little bit too dense. I want to say here that every time I play a game with anybody, unless it's a tournament where someone else has set up the terrain, if I'm having a hand in setting up the terrain, I always ask my opponent if they are happy. I ask them, please move some terrain around, get rid of some, add some in, if you want something different. So it's not me forcing people to play on those tables. And more recently, I am playing with setups which are a little bit more sparse. And I do have some people that says, oh, Vol, you play on really like open terrain, don't you? You actually have a lot of fire lanes, don't you? And that's their perception of my terrain. Gosh, so I mean, you can't make everybody happy. That is the one thing about terrain density. But I agree. I think that when it comes to so many orders being used, less terrain can sometimes be the mitigating factor. And in fact, we get another post here from our friend that I talked about before, Philike, or however you say his name, who mentions that the reason why some people struggle with orders of that many is it's a terrain issue. There's too much terrain. So hey, fair enough. If you guys want to see what everybody else has really said, and there's nothing really else that gets added to this thread of interest, have a look through, but I find it a really interesting issue. Before I'd heard everybody's responses, I would have actually said myself that taking second turn is a no-brainer in a scenario like this, but I'd forgotten some of the factors. in non-symmetrical tables, you know, the density can be a pretty big issue, and some people's idea of a, you know, Goldilocks, not too much, not too sparse sort of terrain is different. And of course, recently I've been playing a lot of armies or lists that don't really rely on the attack, the aggression. I used to play a lot of sort of drop troopers and sort of TO, sort of Shinobu sort of shenanigans. So I might get back into that again. But yeah, I think one thing to take away from this is that there are a few different ways to win a game of Infinity. We've got 2 new missions which have come out recently, which I've tried out. One thing that I think is really good, and I'm so happy that Corvus Belli have finally done this, is to finally recognize that scenarios need more than one win condition. So with the 2 brand new missions, they've finally done something which I think should have been there like since day one, which is to change the scenarios so that one of the scoring opportunities is like Annihilation, where you get 2 points outright for having more kills than the other guy, or gal, if you're playing against a lady. So Show of Force is a new mission where you can either control the transmission antenna in the middle of the table with a normal trooper or a tag, you can win that way, or you can just keep them off it and don't bother about collecting it but kill more troopers. So there's 2 ways to do it. So that encourages having lots of different list styles, not just sort of you know, plonking something at the end of the game. So you could win this by going first and, you know, picking up classifieds and other things as well, and going for the panoplies. So that's another way to do it, but also it allows for a bit more of a dynamic pace during the game. You might start out with the intention to control a transmitter at the end of the game, but you see an opportunity where, okay, I think the chances of me winning are like 75% if I just go after a few high value models. Or maybe there'll be another game where I thought I was just going to try and kill everything, but now that I'm behind on attrition, there might be a shot at me controlling the transmission antenna anyway, so I can do that. So it makes the game so much more interesting, and I'm so glad that CB have actually finally got around to changing that. Had a game recently where I was playing my Wu Ming again up against Garth, and this is the video I showed you, so the table I showed you recently. So I got my Wu Ming. I actually picked tableside this time just to test out the difference between having a much better tableside against his lackluster one, and we were playing Show of Force, which is the mission I just talked about there. So unfortunately, he doesn't get much done in his first turn with his Yuan Yuans and his link team of Drews. He tries out the light grenade launcher but doesn't get much done. So I've got the battle tableside and I've got second turn, and hilariously, one thing I decided to do here was to use the Wu Ming to pick off his ARO piece, I think it was Janzaban, and then I just completely moved them across the table in the pain train, like the whole sort of single file thing, and ended up just audaciously moving to the corner and picking off everything in this corner of the table, this quarter of the table I should say. And when he tried attacking me back, he just couldn't take them out. We've got a killer hacker next to his hacker as well, and he ended up just getting wiped. This game was not exemplary though. I had some pretty good luck. We played another game as well where I was playing Pano against his QK, and I was the one who got smashed in this game. My Pano army wasn't particularly effective though. It was a limited assertion list, just 10 orders, and I couldn't pull it through. But we played the other mission that had come out, Deadly Dance or whatever it's called, can't remember its name. Hopefully you guys are really enjoying Infinity. I've got an event coming up at the end of this month. Not sure which faction I'll be playing, but it will be a 6-round event, so should be a bit of a ball buster. Really looking forward to that, and I think events that do feature more than 10 people should be more than 3 rounds, just because it will be an accurate portrayal of how an individual does in a tournament, the way it should be. You shouldn't just be relying on the luck of the draw and how other people, score in their games. You can't hide from 6 games that will determine where you stand in the pack. Alright, I think I'll sign off here, guys. Enjoy 2017. I'll be back with more videos soon. Catch you next time.